Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's not often that a member of the old meeting gets a plaque mounted in the church in his or her honour. In the case of the Brightwells, two members of the family, father and daughter, were awarded a plaque each. Clearly, these two individuals had made footprints in the sand. So the question is, what were those footprints? The daughter, Lucy Brightwell, was born in Thorpe Hamlet in 1811. The father, Thomas, was born in Ipswich in 1787. There's no mention of the wife and mother, Mary Brightwell, on the plaque, though she had an interesting backstory. She was a sister of the bookseller, printer and bibliophile Simon Wilkin, who produced the first collected edition of the works of Sir Thomas Browne. And the Wilkins had a distinguished nonconformist pedigree. They were the direct descendants of Dr. Thomas Jackham, a Presbyterian who had been ejected from his living at the restoration of Charles II for refusing to accept the 1662 prayer book. So why wasn't Mary Brightwell, with this interesting backstory, featured on the plaques? Simple answer is, she wasn't a member of the old meeting. Mary Brightwell was baptized at St. Mary's Baptist Church in Norwich in 1808, presumably by full immersion. And her brother, Simon Wilkin, also a Baptist, was later made a deacon in the same church. Anyway, Mary Wilkin met her future husband in 1806. The courtship was a long one, 4 years in all. There were many perplexing obstacles, though what those obstacles were was never made public. The marriage eventually took place at the Anglican Church of St. George, Colgate in Norwich on the 6th of June 1810. 5 children were born in the first 5 years of the marriage, after which Mary Brightwell died, very probably during childbirth. Lucy Brightwell was just 4 years old. So with so many small children to look after, it's not surprising that within 2 years, again at St. George Colgate, Thomas Brightwell remarried. His second wife, Anne Hawkins, also a Baptist, was a close family friend. So close, in fact, that she had accompanied her new husband and his late wife on their honeymoon. She was the daughter of Thomas Hawkins, a wealthy Norwich grocer, another deacon at St. Mary's. The whole Hawkins family had been brought up under the roof of St. Mary's. Both Anne Hawkins and her brother William were tutored by the Hebrew scholar Joseph Kinghorn, the minister there. The household at 3 Surrey Street, where the Brightwells eventually settled, gradually contracted as one sibling after another left to get married. By the early 1840s, only Lucy and her brother Thomas remained. Thomas had joined his family law firm, which operated from the Surrey Street address. Lucy never married. Why is unclear, but she may well have remained, in the words of a contemporary, decoratively prepared. Family life at Surrey Street seems to have been reasonably happy. Looking back in the 1860s, Lucy made the following confession: "I feel disposed to digress for a moment to observe what a blessing are family ties, the endearing bounds of consanguinity, and in how many happy ways their influence is exerted." Of course, She was also well aware of the dangers that endearing bounds of consanguinity could harbour. In a letter written in 1845, she confessed, "It's a bad thing for the happiness of a child that she be made too dependent. This I have experienced to my cost." Unfortunately, she doesn't enlarge on this thought. The most important man in Lucy's life was undoubtedly her father, Thomas Brightwell, son of a tanner whose business lay on the River Orwell, not far from the mill operated by the father of John Austin, the famous legal philosopher with whom Lucy later became acquainted. It was a pious household. Thomas's father taught his son to avoid anything that might involve any hint of pleasure, and made it clear that his own experience of life had been disappointing, vexatious, and dismaying. This life is a state of trial and trouble at the best, his granddaughter reported him as saying. Thomas was educated at local schools. As a dissenter, a university education wasn't an option, at least in England. It may be significant that in her diary, Lucy chose to attack the English university's conservatism by transcribing some comments by Macaulay. The glory of being farther behind the age than any other portion of the British people is one which the University of Oxford acquired early and never lost. Temperamentally, Thomas Brightwell was a hidden being, as his daughter described him, a man who exuded a calm reticence. However, this did not prevent him becoming a prominent figure in the cutthroat world of local politics. He was an active member of Norwich City Council, elected mayor in November 1836, just a year after the upheavals caused by the Municipal Corporations Act. His political views were Whiggish. In his commonplace book, he transcribed a poem by Lord Byron satirizing the Prince Regent, entitled "Lines composed on the occasion of His Royal Highness the Prince Regent being seen standing between the coffins of Henry VIII and Charles I in the Royal Vault at Windsor." Behind that calm reticence, that facade, Brightwell clearly harboured some fairly radical anti-monarchical sentiments, perhaps especially so when it came to the Prince Regent. It seems that he was an oppositionist by nature. He considered that the executive arm of government belonged to the Tory party by right, whereas Parliament's backbenchers belonged to the Whigs. For a true Whig is not in his element unless in a situation of independence, to watch and censure even his own brother become a minister. He claimed that all the Whigs who in his time had departed from what he characterised as a watching system died dispirited and broken-hearted. Outside the political bear pit, Brightwell's great love was the natural world, reflected in 1821 in his election to a fellowship of the Linnean Society. He was a member of the Norwich Entomological Society, along with his brother-in-law Simon Wilkin. Other members included John Curtis, author of British Entomology, William Jackson Hooker, later to become the director of Kew Gardens, John Lindley, who became Professor of Botany at the University of London, and the Reverend William Kirby, co-author of An Introduction to Entomology. These 6 men had a mutually agreeable social and intellectual relationship. A letter from Thomas Brightwell to Simon Wilkin survives, in which he discussed Sir Thomas Browne's notes on coral. He revealed that he had been studying coral under the microscope a good deal lately and had come to the conclusion that coral hardened by secretion. Subsequently, he studied leeches, publishing a paper on his success in harvesting their eggs, which concluded that the physiology of leeches proclaimed the architect whose works are perfect while his ways are past finding out. He was also an expert on protists, a diverse group of microorganisms that lived in pools and ditches, publishing a book and several articles on his research. His identification of a member of the genus of Asplachnidae, found in freshwater lakes, led to the creature being named in his honour Asplachna Brightwellii. To advance his research, he became interested in microscopes and in 1852 founded the Norwich Microscopical Society, one of whose members was Jeremiah James Coleman, the Norwich Mustard King. Brightwell's fascination with the natural world was not limited to animalcules. In his commonplace book, he transcribed a passage on the behaviour of reindeer in Siberia, taken from Adolf Ehrman's Travels in Siberia, published in 1848. I had already had occasion to remark the remarkable longing which the reindeer have for man's urine, but I never saw it so distinctly as today. In order to gratify this desire, some of these shy animals came up close to the tent. They ran up on full trot to catch the stream in the air, and with their underlip protruded, licked with avidity the wetted snow. It is manifest that it is the saltiness of the fluid which awakens their desire, but in so extraordinary a degree that the taming of the reindeer seems to depend upon it. In no other case do they lay aside their natural shyness or apparent aversions to men. When a desire is satisfied, they appear to have acquired new strength and proceed with more life and spirit. Probably these effects are attributable to the ammoniacal salts in the human urine, since similar constituents are recommended by our physicians to strengthen the nerves. Brightwell is a founder member of the Norfolk and Norwich Museum and used his position on Norwich City Council to encourage its development. In 1850, he moved a motion that the City Council make a grant of £50 towards the support of the museum, which proved to be a step towards the council taking over all its expenses, municipalisation by stealth. He was a founder member of the Norfolk and Norwich Archaeological Society and wrote a learned article that was published in the first volume of the Transactions of the Society in 1847. He subscribed to the Norwich Foreign Book Society, whose members included Amelia Opie and the young aspiring writer George Borrow. He was a member of the Norfolk and Norwich Literary Institution, a self-consciously scholarly offshoot of the Norfolk and Norwich Subscription Library. And he was a member of the Old Meeting Book Club, a first-class assembly of leading men, as it was described. After the passing of the Public Libraries Act in 1850, he was one of the two prime movers behind the campaign for the establishment of a free library in Norwich, the other being his friend Jeremiah James Coleman. He had a pretty wide circle of friends amongst the Norwich elite. As early as 1811, he was socialising with William Taylor, author of a famous 3-volume survey of German poetry, and with the novelist and translator Anne Plumtree. He also knew Frank Sayers, the playwright, Philip Martineau, the founder of the Norwich Subscription Library, Dawson Turner, the Yarmouth banker and collector, the physician Edward Rigby, who was the famous father of quads, Joseph Kinghorn, the minister of St. Mary's, Sir James Edward Smith, the first president of the Linnean Society and a close neighbour on Surrey Street, and those literary lions, Amelia Ropey and George Borrow. Like other members of the Victorian upper middle class, Brightwell spent considerable amounts of time and money entertaining. Besides his Norwich friends, many academics and nonconformist luminaries visited his house on Surrey Street. Men like the Cambridge geologist Adam Sedgwick, missionaries such as Robert Moffat, the father-in-law of David Livingstone, Joseph Mullins, a Congregationalist minister working in India, and George Pritchard, another Congregationalist working in Tahiti. The explorer of Egyptian antiquities, Giovanni Battista Belzoni, was another visitor. And of course, all these men his daughter Lucy would have met. Thomas Brightwell's scientific interest in no way lessened his Christian convictions. He was a member of the Old Meeting for 50 years and a deacon for over 30 years. Though, like his friend William Youngman, he also attended St. Mary's Baptist Church. It was no uncommon thing for him to write letters to William Brock, the pastor of St. Mary's, a charismatic personality with his tall, somewhat thin and pliant figure, easy and careless gait, and flaxen hair lying in no particular direction. Who does that remind you of? Boris Johnson, maybe. He was a strict Sabbatarian, and he was also a virulent anti-Catholic. He would agree with Froude that the Catholic religion was a superstition which was but the counterpart of magic and witchcraft, incredible then and evermore to the sane and healthy intelligence. He was well versed in theology, particularly the work of the great German theologians. His most famous published book was a translation from the German of Friedrich Rosenmüller's commentaries on the Old Testament. Although his daughter claims there was no gloom or constraint about her father's religion, on Saturday nights he hid all the books that the family had been reading during the week and replaced them with biblical texts, thus removing temptation out of the way of children and servants. Every day, morning and evening, passages from the Bible were read aloud. To ensure that nothing unsuitable might be read, the margins of the family Bible were highlighted with warnings in red ink. Despite these rigidities, Brightwell developed a degree of skepticism about the widely held view that the book of Genesis should be interpreted as a manual of geology. In his commonplace book, he transcribed a passage from Coleridge's Table Talk, which rejected the notion of the universal effects of the biblical flood. However, he was deeply concerned about the discoveries of science as bearing upon scriptural revelation, though he was convinced that all would eventually contribute to prove the truth of God's word. He refused to accept Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, and shrank with pain from some of the statements uttered by sympathisers with that school of thought. He doesn't appear to have owned a copy of Darwin's Origin of Species, though he could have borrowed a copy of the second edition in the subscription library, which the library had acquired within months of its publication. Interestingly, though, he did own a copy of the second edition of Darwin's Journal of Researches, now known as the Voyage of the Beagle. Clearly, a man of so many parts would not have failed to have exerted a powerful influence on his daughter. Lucy certainly inherited her father's anti-Catholicism. In her novel, My Brother Harold, Norman Allen, the son of the Laird of Glenfair, describes how he witnessed the Pope in St. Peter's Square giving his blessing to the kneeling multitudes, characterized by the author as deluded worshippers. However, Lucy did not join her father at the old meeting. In October 1836, along with her sister Mary, Lucy was received into her mother's church at St. Mary's, though there is no mention in the record of the two sisters being baptized. Whether she succumbed to paternal pressure, we don't know, but Lucy became disillusioned with the Baptists. In 1848, she received communion at the old meeting for the first time, though without asking for dismissal from St. Mary's. And 3 years later, in 1851, she was formally admitted as a member of the old meeting. Why she changed her allegiance isn't known, though her heart searchings coincided with a dispute between her uncle Simon Wilkin and William Brock, pastor of St. Mary's, over whether Wilkin could continue as a deacon while living in London. The argument over whether communion should be open or closed, in other words, whether baptism was an essential prerequisite for new members, also simmered, though the dispute did not come to a head until 1860, when a section of the congregation, unable to compromise, took their case to law. Lucy never returned to St. Mary's, but remained a member of the old meeting until her death. So what sort of person was she? In a word, bookish. In 1844, to take a year at random, amongst other books, she read Macaulay's Essays, Bulwer Lytton's Devereux, a historical novel set in the reign of Queen Anne, William Cook Taylor's Revolutions, Insurrections and Conspiracies of Europe, Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, Plutarch's Lives, Shakespeare's plays, Goethe's Wilhelm Meister, John Miley's Rome and the Paganism, Michael Gwynn's Steam Voyage down the Danube, with sketches of Hungary, Wallachia, Serbia and Turkey, Captain Best's Excursions in Albania, and Robert Walsh's narrative of a journey from Constantinople to England. As well as the reading, she attended public lectures. In 1844, for example, she heard a lecture by John Herschel, the astronomer, and what's even more significant, had supper with him. In July and August 1847, she attended the meetings of the Archaeological Society in Norwich and listened to at least 10 lectures. She also heard Joseph Wolfe lecturing on his travels in Bukhara, and later heard Wolfe lecture on the Prophet Muhammad at the girls' model school in Norwich. That she was well aware of the feeling against the education of women is clear from her transcription of some thoughts by Macaulay on the subject. We have often heard of men who wish, as almost all men of sense wish, that women should be highly educated. Significantly, the phrase, "as almost all men of sense wish," Lucy underlined. She made no attempt to hide her intellectual interests from her diary. There are no statements, such as her distinguished contemporary Harriet Martineau made, that it was not proper for ladies to study very conspicuously. She took care to transcribe a passage from Stanley's Life of Thomas Arnold to the effect that it was a solemn duty to cultivate the intellect. I am satisfied that a neglected intellect is far oftener the cause of mischief to a man than a perverted or overvalued one. She was also well aware of other examples of a gender divide. For instance, the differences in the way moral lapses of men and women were viewed. She recorded Macaulay's opinion that in our country a woman forfeits her place in society by what in a man is too commonly considered as an honourable distinction, or at worst as a venial error. Study of languages was one of the means by which she cultivated her intellect. It's clear from the evidence in her diary that she had a good reading knowledge of Italian and German, and she continued her studies of these languages in later life. In 1852, she paid a Professor Schweitzer for German lessons, and the following year bought 14 books in German. And the fact that she used the Latin quotations in her diary suggests that she might have had at least a reading knowledge of Latin. But we also know from the diary that she studied Hebrew with a well-known Jewish scholar, Benjamin Marcus. Marcus's admittance into the Roman Catholic Church is reported to have caused considerable surprise amongst the Jewish community. Latterly, he made a career for himself as a lecturer, Protestantism receding before him as the rotten bough before the storm. Lucy's diary contains pages of individual Hebrew words arranged in alphabetical order, designed for a student of Hebrew who would be expected to fill in the entries with definitions and examples. Though the study of Hebrew wasn't a rare phenomenon in Victorian England, the Norwich-born evangelical Charlotte Elizabeth Tonner, who considered that Jewish persecution was a legacy of popery, and urged her fellow Protestants to throw a shield over the Jews, was fluent in Hebrew. Lucy inherited her father's interest in art. Thomas Brightwell was a friend of John Sell Cotman. He owned a collection of paintings by members of the Dutch school, and he commissioned work from James Stark and John Crome. We know that he paid John Sell Cotman to teach Lucy drawing, and it was money well spent, since Cotman told Dawson Turner that Lucy's copy of Rembrandt's painting The Mill was astonishingly etched and more like Rembrandt than anything I have ever seen. She drew and etched Oliver Cromwell's house in Ely, and in June 1848 sent copies of the etchings to Thomas Carlyle, who acknowledged the gift in a letter that was full of praise for her artistry. She put her artistic talent to scientific use by drawing microscopic creatures, tracing the footsteps of divine wisdom, as she described it, for her father's book, Sketch of a Fauna Infusoria for East Norfolk. Although she's not named, The artist is described by her father in the preface as a member of my own family. It's clear that it was she who produced the etchings as well as colouring them by hand. She later recalled her father's eager interest in studying these animalcules and the practical difficulties involved in drawing them. My first drawing was made before breakfast, and immediately after the meal my pencil was again in requisition. I began to figure a long-stalked, bull-headed animal, which, whilst I was sketching it, Proteus-like altered its form, becoming pear-shaped, and then splitting in a queer and most provoking manner. Fast as I drew, I could not keep pace with its movements. I was almost ready to despair. My father, in the meantime, was all eagerness to watch the progress, and could scarcely keep his eyes from the glass long enough to afford me the necessary time for observing and figuring its various phases. As best I could, I rendered upon my paper the successive transformations this curious animal underwent. Never before or since have I beheld the process of growth visibly carried on before my eyes. She was a prolific writer. It's doubtful whether she wrote for money, since she inherited over £90,000 in today's values under the terms of her father's will. She wrote because it was what women of her class did. Writing, both published and unpublished, was the norm for the educated gentlewoman. She had several friends who were also writers. Hannah Geltart, the daughter of Samuel Martin, a partner in Gurney's Bank, originally a Quaker but received into the Congregation of St. Mary's in December 1836, was a prolific writer of improving works for children. There was also Anne Wright of Buxton, the aunt of Anna Sewell. The wife of a Quaker banker, Anne Wright published several works on geology. And of course there was the novelist Amelia Opie, whose papers the Brightwells acquired on Mrs. Opie's death. Lucy produced more than 20 books in her lifetime. Her first book, published when she was 43, the biography of Amelia Opie, was the most successful financially. The biography she later wrote of her father was clearly a labour of love, but has since become an indispensable source of information on the cultural history of Norwich in the first half of the 19th century. It's fair to say that her other books were merely workmanlike. A typical review was the short notice of her life of the ornithologist Alexander Wilson. This brief and not incorrect memoir of Alexander Wilson is compiled from previous biographic sketches of the Paisley weaver, who emigrated to America and there became famous as an ornithologist. The author has not expended much labour on her task, but perhaps as much as such a work deserves. Full stop. Mrs. Gaskell wrote of the difficulty women had of reconciling the life of a writer with their lives as women. When men gave up the professions they had been engaged in before becoming writers, someone else stepped into the place they had occupied. For the wife, daughter or mother, no one else could occupy the gap they had left as well as she whom God had appointed to fill that place. A woman's principal work in life is hardly left to her own choice, nor can she drop the domestic charges devolving on her as an individual. On the other hand, she must not hide her gifts in a napkin. Lucy echoed Mrs. Gaskell's views. In the quiet, unobtrusive and commonplace duties of the household, most women may find their proper sphere and employ themselves both usefully and honourably. And there is for such sweet encouragement in the thought that home duties fulfilled in a right spirit, are approved by God as well as acceptable to man. Lucy was, in fact, selling herself short. Amongst her other talents, she had a business brain. She was able to calculate to the last penny the profit she earned from her biography of Amelia Opie. After deducting costs for advertising, postage of presentation copies, registration at Stationers' Hall, binding, engraving the portrait of Mrs. Opie for the frontispiece, copying the manuscript, and the cost of a reader's ticket at the subscription library for a research, she calculated that in 1855 she made a profit of £45. That's about £2,500 in today's values. At another point in the diary, she took the profit she made on the biography of Mrs. Opie, added it to the money her late sister Mary had bequeathed her, and purchased an annuity after carefully calculating the percentage return. Lucy had many friendships, both male and female, but one seems to have been particularly important, namely her friendship with George Borrow, the Durham-born novelist, traveller, translator, and Romany scholar. In the surviving letters Borrow wrote home from his trek in Eastern Europe in 1844, he made several references to dear Lucy, and the diary contains some 24 references to Borrow and his family during the years 1843 to 1851, when the Borrows were living in Oulton Cottage near Lowestoft. Lucy paid at least 10 visits to Oulton in the period 1843 to 1851, sometimes staying for weeks at a time. Her parents stayed there without her on at least one occasion as well. So what sort of relationship did Lucy have with this rather difficult character, George Borrow? It was, in fact, very like the relationship with her father, in that it was deferential. The first mention of Borrow in the diary is in November 1843, when Lucy paid what she described as a second visit to Oulton. Reportedly, Borrow was in a playful mood, or else he'd had too much to drink. "Poor old Lucy," she recorded him as declaring. "Nice old darling, my old sister. Poor Lucy with her funny eye." Lucy had a squint, by the way. "Old beast, old Strood." Strood, I think, is a mare. "I say, old chap, you must be dipped." There's no comment in the diary over what she felt about this extraordinarily rude outburst. Perhaps the insult was overshadowed by what must have been an incredibly significant event that took place during the same visit. It was at Oulton that she took communion in an Anglican church for the first time. Was she pressured to do so by Borrow, a lifelong Anglican? The diary is silent. In May 1845, she stayed at Oulton for 17 days. This time Borrow was in a cynical mood. He warned her never to run after people and never be off your guard. All flesh is grass. Remember that friendship is like grass. Do not write so much to people. Remember, my dear, sum multum superbum, which Ingrid might translate as "I'm very extraordinary," or words to that effect. Again, she makes no comment, but directly after this entry, she transcribed a line from Carlyle. "Alas, it is so much easier to love men while they exist only on paper. She had a discerning eye for male beauty, even though she never appears to have succumbed. In her diary, she was careful to give a physical description of Sir James Brooke, the first white Raja of Sarawak, who had been educated at Norwich School. Sir James had darkish hair and grey whiskers. He was tallish and broad-shouldered, with a strong-built frame. Then there was Dr. Scoresby, author of Arctic Regions, who was tall, slender, with snowy hair, black eyebrows, and deep-set dark eyes, very striking-looking, about 55 years old. Edward Irving, a Scottish Episcopalian and an enthusiast for speaking in tongues, made a great impression with his long hair and swarthy complexion, which gave him the appearance of a dashing cavalry officer. Poor Reverend Brown, the young minister of Lowestoft Chapel, was dismissed as possessing an unpromising exterior. Lucy was able to explore the world outside Norwich through kinship networks and shared intellectual interests. When she was writing her diary in the 1840s and 1850s, she paid several visits to Cambridge, dining with prominent academics, including Professor John Grote, the philosopher, and his brother Arthur, an administrator in India and a famous entomologist. In 1851, she visited the Great Exhibition 3 times. She also visited London Zoo, the Royal Academy, arranged for a daguerreotype to be taken of her father, called on Amelia Opie, who was staying in Russell Square, and visited her uncle, Simon Wilkin. In February 1861, a boat with a crew of 8 went to the assistance of a sailing ship wrecked the previous night in heavy seas off Blakeney. Almost as soon as it left the safety of the harbour, the boat capsized and the whole crew were drowned. A relief fund was set up by the rector of Blakeney for the widows and orphans of the men who were lost. And the following year, Lucy provided £180, that's almost £8,000 in today's values, towards the purchase of a lifeboat at Blakeney, which was named in her honour the Brightwell. Lucy never interrogated her motives for charitable giving in her diary, but a simple desire to conform to how well-to-do middle-class women were expected to behave doesn't seem an adequate motive, particularly in those cases where the work involved was especially harrowing. The most compelling explanation is Christian commitment. As Lucy recorded in her diary, prayer and kindly intercourse with the poor are the 2 great safeguards of spiritual life. In October 1845, Lucy confessed in a letter that her life was one continual, even course of quiet and comfort. Sorrow comes not near me. I have all things richly to enjoy. However, unlike her father, who had a sunshiny old age, her later years were difficult. She inherited her father's eye problems. In old age, Thomas Brightwell taught himself Braille because of failing eyesight. Lucy recorded that it was towards the end of August 1864, when she would have been 53, that she felt the first sensation of blindness in one of her eyes. We can only imagine the devastation she would have felt, given her love of reading and her pleasure in socializing. It's possible she had someone to read to her perhaps a servant, Mary Ann Gosling, who she treated very generously in her will. In the autumn of 1874, a brain disease, as it was described in her obituary, set in that was to bring about her death. She was buried at the Rosary Cemetery in Norwich, the graveyard of choice for dissenters, in April 1875, just 7 years after the death of her father. The title Lucy chose for her diary was Read, Seen and Heard. Quite a good summing up of her life, at least in its outward aspects. Certainly books played a major part in that life, but there's little evidence of engagement with what she read, and no hint of argument. In fact, her choice of reading material appears to relate exclusively to those writers with whom she agreed. Besides the reading, she also saw and she also heard. She had a wide circle of friends and acquaintances. She cultivated the great and the good. She carved out a moderately successful career for herself as a biographer and journalist, and she did charitable work for organizations like the Norwich City Mission. However, there's no indication that she had the absorbing interest of an Elizabeth Barrett Browning in politics, that she wished to touch the everyday life of her age and hold it with her two hands. And the diary provides very few clues as to her inner life. In fact, you could say that Lucy Brightwell remains, from that point of view, something of a hidden being, which, as you remember, is how she described her father. Thank you very much.